Hello, everybody, and welcome to this month's Construction Contract Administration Practice Group. So, Jim, over to you.
Hey, thank you, Matthew. Welcome, everyone. A couple of things I just wanted to say. Doug Freeman was not able to join us today, so I'm here in the driver's seat, and I wanted to just reiterate. Matthew, you can go to the next slide while I'm just saying, please participate. Yeah, go ahead to the next one, too. Please participate, raise your hand, type in questions. All of this is so much better with your participation. There are some questions and issues raised every time that we're together that are just amazingly coherent, deep, thoughtful, and I really appreciate that. And I know Matthew does and the whole organization. We have been through, this is the as you see in the title, we've done 7 segments that follow along with the Construction Contract Administration Practice Guide. Actually, we are in Chapter 6, which are site visits, observations, and inspections, and we are just doing a second part of Chapter 6. So in the first part, we looked at site observation requirements and what some of the expectations were for parties. We also reviewed some of the procedures for visiting a site. We covered safety issues. And now we're going to move on to the next part of site observations. And Matthew, you can go to the next slide. And we're going to begin with non-conforming work. We're going to talk about that, what is related to that, and how we comply or don't comply with the contract documents with work. And we're going to talk about defective work and what defective work is involved in a project. So non-conforming, that doesn't comply with the contract documents. It may or may not have been correctly installed, but it's non-conforming, and we'll talk about that some. Defective work is not installed correctly. It may be the correct product, but it's not installed correctly. It may be a defective product, or it could be that the installation really isn't correct, and any of those could be defined as defective work. But the thing that we want to remember, the thing that's critical and the hardest thing, I think, for many of us, getting the contractor notified and getting them notified right away. When you have non-conforming or defective work, as everybody realizes, work builds on top of work, and notifying the contractor as soon as possible is key and is critical. So let's take a look at the next slide about how we do that. One of the things that's always been pointed out to me that particularly with anyone that represents the legal risk management side of our practice of construction, engineering, or architecture, is to use forms that are specific, if you can, to the part of work that you are in. So here's an example of a corrective action request. When would you use this document? When would you need this document? Well, referring to AIA contracts, either our B101 contract or the general conditions A201 indicate that the engineer or the architect is going to take action to define what is wrong. And you can't read that form, but I put it in as an example. So there are certain CSI forms that are examples of how to document this. So these would also be something that would be a part of review of a pay application, whether you're certifying or decertifying an application. Yes, we're paying you for part of what you asked for, but not the defective part. So these are forms that would tag along with the performance of our work in the field. Remembering, of course, that the owner can accept work that is non-conforming. Is solely their decision, and that the contractor is responsible for the cost of correcting non-conforming work when it's found and pointed out. So CSI has a form 9.8A, which I believe might be on the next page. And we can go ahead and look at that, Matthew. But the point here is, don't just use your observation report. You'll see here compared on the next slide, side by side. On the left is a field observation report. On the right is a non-conforming work report. Part of the risk management education that I've had over the years is it's important that this distinguishing documentation be a part of your delivering work. Well, why? Why is that? One answer is that when you're 200 site reports into the project, it's pretty easy just to see a form from the designer, architect, engineer of record and assume it's just another site report. So you're assisting in the project not falling into a complacent attitude of, well, there's just another form, let's put that in the field observation file and record it as such. So it's an opportunity to distinguish between steps of delivery of service on the site. So Matthew, let me stop right there and see, are there any hands raised?
We don't see any hands raised at the moment. I am going to point out that I am at the CSI headquarters and the fire alarm is going off. So I'm going to try to keep my phone muted until either it goes off or we have a question come in. So Jim, I'll hand it back to you.
Super. That's the way CA is, right? It's like putting a fire out. This is so absolutely perfect because it seems like it's always a fire on the job site and we're rushing out there to put it out, get things back on track. So how appropriate. Let's go to the next slide and continue to talk a little bit about defective or non-conforming work. So let's talk about some ways that happens. First of all, the owner's decision on defective work, should the owner reject that work, then the contractor is given a reasonable amount of time to fix it. Should that not happen, the owner has the opportunity to fix that work with their own personnel or other contractors at the original contractor's expense. And if the cost to fix that work exceeds monies that are left in the project, then the original contractor is expected to pay that difference. But again, the owner can accept that work if he or she chooses, and in doing so, perhaps expects a decrease in the contract price. I've had projects, for example, where certain finishes maybe weren't up to the requirements within the contract specifications, within the contract documents, but perhaps in areas that were back of house or unobserved by the public, and so the owner was willing to consider letting those finishes stay for some adjustment in the cost of the work. So that's just one example of what might happen should the owner decide to accept that defective work. So this is a slide of a stop work order. This is no small undertaking, and that document is a critical document to think about, and that action is an action that has huge implications on a project. We could do a seminar or a webinar just about the stoppage of work. But if the contractor is stopped in their action, it has severe ramifications for the cost and also for the time. The owner is the only party that has the contractual right to stop work. They will often look to the architect or engineer for guidance, and this step would typically be taken in the case of something that was egregiously defective or non-compliant and wasn't being corrected in a timely fashion. My experience with stop work has been more about quality of performance, not quality of the installed product, where contractors were perhaps overwhelmed and behind and not meeting critical milestones, and the owner stepped in to say, stop, that's it. This is non-conforming because it's off schedule. and I'm going to go another route to try to finish the job. Now, the contractor has a right to also stop work if they're not being paid in a timely fashion. And they may have, which are all outlined in their construction contract, opportunities to terminate if the owner is not paying them, and that is through no fault of the contractor. So they too can stop work if they find themselves in that predicament. So let's, Matthew, move on to the next slide and stop for a second just to see if there are any questions about stoppage of work. Any hands
No
raised?
questions. No questions or hands raised at the moment, and the fire alarm has gone off. So at least the building's not on fire. But we did have one comment indicating that you were on fire, Jim, and that you had really hot content. So.
Well, whoever it was, thank you very much for saying so. So let's talk a minute about delivery, storage of products that we're going to use on the site. This is spelled out in great detail within the specification sections. Delivery of the products is one component, and the storage of those products is yet another. So first of all, it is incumbent on the contractor to acquire, purchase, have purchase orders receive, unload, and have at the site ready for their use materials as they need them, with the exception of anything that might be owner provided in the project. These materials should be free of defect and damages, and they should be ready to use or rejected, and that notification gone back immediately to the provider. So the contractor is required to get them there, and then the contractor is required to store them properly. I can't imagine the number of job sites that any of us have been on that had materials, for example, that were in the direct sunlight for long periods of time that shouldn't be, that were on the ground and not on pallets as they should be. So it's important for us to think about that in our layout of laydown areas, for example, on job sites. So they need to be denoted in our contract documents. Sometimes, often with those of you that work in the city, particularly large cities, there may not be any on-site storage, and all of that is off-site. Typically in North Carolina, we don't do that. Government does not like for materials to be off-site, but if they are, they can be bonded and insured in locations that the state accepts and be off-site. And then if they are off-site, they have to be received in some sequence that feeds the construction schedule, but also meets the environmental conditions that are specified for those materials. So that will be important to see happen. If they are off-site, then there's a piece of the time that we as architects or engineers may need to go to the storage facility and verify those materials for payment, which is why they may be in a bonded and insured warehouse, so that we're sure that ownership shifting and that ownership, the title of ownership, is maintained. Because once they're paid for, they belong to the owner, and that applies if those materials are off-site as well. So the next slide, Matthew, is also about materials. Let's take a look at that. And the protection of those various materials. So they need to be properly protected. Here we see some materials that should possibly have been covered and should possibly be out of direct sunlight. There are others that maybe are fine stored just the way they are. But our specifications will depend on the manufacturer's requirements and industry standards, and sometimes just plain common sense. How many of you have looked up at the steel in one of your buildings and see the boot prints walking across the webs of whatever beams that may be erected already? And so it's important to see common sense measures in place too. These products should come to the site with material safety data sheets, which also may comment on the storage. And in our specifications, of course, in Part 1, just the general explanations, and Part 3, the execution of those specifications, is where there's language speaking to the storage on site. So those are important comments to think about in delivery and storage, and what you will see is protection of materials when you go out to make your site observations. So Matthew will shift to the next piece, which is the construction schedule, and see if there are any hands raised now.
There are one question, I guess one set of questions from the same individual. So Sharon asks, for cost, is it best interest of owner to carry bond and insurance of material storage warehouse?
Well, if they are in a bonded and insured warehouse, then those would be paid for by the contractor, but would be showing the owner as an additional insured. So it's a great question, and yes, the owner, and that's one of the things that we would look at as a piece of documentation on the project. Well, my owner is listed as an additional insured. That means that if the place burnt down after payment was made, my owner is made whole. If the place burnt down before the owner pays, then the contractor is made whole. So yes, I would absolutely require them.
And then second part of the question here from Sharon, I think you started to talk about it a little bit on this slide. She was asking, could you speak more to the protection of materials between the delivery and installation and after installation prior to cover, as an example of CLT and OSB products where torn packaging are exposed to weather and water before the roof installed. Is it best addressed prior to start of construction and allocated as a budgeted item, or is there another way in which you could essentially cover yourself for that period between delivery and installation and potentially being covered by the appropriate weatherproofing?
I think it is first best enunciated in the specifications prior to bid, with the contractor understanding. For example, I've worked with firms who have a separate supplementary general conditions section specifically about the storage of material. I'll use an example of what prompted this in the firm I was working with. Sheetrock. So when are you going to finish it? How is it going to be protected after it's installed and it's below freezing? And so this firm decided, you know what, we're going to spend a lot of time explaining what we expect with the storage, delivery, protection of materials. And they created a whole specification section that was supplemental just for that, and listed various parts, being sure they didn't change anything that the manufacturer's requirements would note, but adding how serious, I guess is the way I should describe it, how serious they were about the protection of those products, because it's critical. And if you go to most job sites that I've been on, the construction community would say, well, nobody's ever enforced that. We leave that insulation laying out there under plastic for months at the time. Nobody's ever made us do this before. Okay, well, I understand. But that wasn't this job, and that wasn't these specifications, and you knew all that when you bid the job. So let's get trailers out here and get it enclosed, because that's what the manufacturer says. One of those tough things. So first piece, having it in the specifications clearly. Second piece is absolutely at the pre-construction conference, going over how you expect these kind of things to be maintained would be really important. And another chance for everyone there to hear how serious your firm is about the protection of those materials. So I think beforehand, before the bid, and once you're getting started are two places it would be critically important to focus on that.
And we have a follow-up question that I have a feeling you're going to wish Doug was on the call for. But Steven asks, at what point does detailed specification of means and methods of protection begin to relieve the contractor from other M&M not specified, which may occur?
Wow. That's a great question, and I don't have any idea. the legal response to that, that's a great question. I do wish Doug was here to answer that, because that probably would be a better question to review with some risk management experts about when is that handover, finished. I could go through various examples of jobs that I've been on about, nobody wants to use the word MOLD, but here in the Southeast, mold is a part of everyday life, and we have to talk about it. And so where did that start? When did that start? Whose fault is it that it's there? How does it get fixed? What do we do now? Or sort of kind of like that, I think, a subject of your question. And gosh, I just don't know what the answer is. Probably the always safe go-to is it depends. It will depend on other pieces of the construction and protection. It'll depend on the contractors and the owners and the designers, and probably the attorneys that they all employ. And I know that's not a good answer, but without someone, and if there is anybody on the phone who knows, raise your hand and let Matthew know. If you're in the risk management business or an attorney and would like to take a swing at that one, please raise your hand.
Well, we have one comment came in here from John, who's being quite humorous today in the comments. He calls it organic growth. They don't use the M word either.
That's right. Yes.
And we have a comment that came in here from Clint. Oh, yep. We have a comment came in here from Clint who says, in my firm, we do not review MSDS. The thought is that reviewing this document indicates that we approve and have knowledge or expertise in MSDS, and therefore would be liable for the misapplication or hazards of the product. And not reviewing these, we are also missing on the information that you have stated. It's sound practice, or are we actually exposing ourselves to liability?
Well, most of my experience is also we don't review, but we require it to be on the site and accessible, so that the people that are working there can, in fact, have access to it, the ones that are responsible for means and methods. So I think that's similar to the practices that I know about that sort of do it the same way. At one of the places I work here in North Carolina, they refer to mold as an environmental substance. They don't use the M word either. Any others, Matthew, before we go to schedule?
We just had a request here from Chris to repeat the question about means and methods. Chris, I'm sorry. Once it's answered, it's pulled off my screen. The gist of it, I believe, was at what point in specifying the means and methods for information do you essentially take on the liability and remove it from the contractor? If that's the best I can probably summarize that question at the moment, since it's off my screen.
All right.
So with that, I think we're going to move on so we can try to get through the rest of these slides. Jim?
Sure. Let's go to construction progress schedule. So one of our primary activities while we're doing observations is being familiar with the project construction schedule. Something that is really smart to look at before you go to the site visit, because you'd like to know what it is you should be seeing while you're there. And I'm a big believer in carrying a lot of stuff, so perhaps you have a small copy of that while you're visiting the site to look at milestones, see if they've been met, and look at that in detail, and take the time to note what discrepancies are in that schedule, so that once you have finished walking the site, you may review that with the superintendent who is there at the site. Everything that I try to focus on, I guess I should primarily cover with the blanket of timely communication. So if you are, in fact, looking at the schedule, you're at the job, you see some issues, having conversations with the superintendent on the site, with the project manager if they're there, to point those out and ask about what the requirements are going to be, what's their plan for recovering if they're behind, being sure that their schedule is accurate so that when you move into reviewing pay applications, you're sure that the schedule is on target because it has implications to your pay application review. If they are not on schedule, that's a meaningful grounds of discussion about where and how much they should be paid. So these are important items to look at, to notice while you're there, and to discuss, in my opinion, if you can, while you're at the job site. Now, were Doug on the call, he would say, yes, but don't feel pressured to do that. If you aren't certain about certain things, don't ever feel pressured to deliver some information at the site, even to answer certain questions at the site. Just indicating that you've made notes about what those questions are, or made notes about what your issue might be. You're going to go back to the office and take a look at some things, and you'll get in touch with them as quickly as possible, no later, if you're able to do that, no later than tomorrow. Give them some idea of when you'll be back in touch, and remove yourself from any kind of pressure situation to give an answer. That's important to do. You want to be timely, but you don't want to be rushed. So let's look at the next slide, Matthew, and touch on record keeping and reporting that go along with site observations. Sometimes there are electronic forms or hard copy of what stage of activity is critical here to the project. There are a lot of softwares out there today to help support record management, capturing sections, components of steel erected. This slide is about using the tools that are out there and available to you that the contractor may share and you have in community of use, so that you're able to document, well, he had this project phased and these phases are in place and that's ahead of schedule. These phases are not, and that's behind schedule, but overall things are moving according to schedule, and things are working okay. So there are tools, again, that maybe the construction community uses more than the architects and engineers as a record keeping and reporting within house. But we too have standardized forms that we use at various parts of the project, and we're going to talk about some of those as we move forward. But there are some that are required, I would call it, to manage the project. Our observation reports, correspondence that goes back and forth, requests for, you're going to hear me use the word information. I'll tell you why in a minute. Schedules and meeting minutes, communication reports, submittals, tests, pay apps, and change orders. All these are pieces of the record keeping and reporting that will be critical pieces of information at moments in the job. And I'll go ahead and say it this way: should things go awry? They always seem to be more important when we're using them to figure something out than when things went well. So let's go ahead to the next slide, Matthew, to the first one, and see if there are any questions before we talk about observation reports.
Nope, at the moment we are good. So back to you.
Okay. So these observation reports are an opportunity for us to record what we see. There are various ways to do this. I touched a second ago on softwares that are out there. Friends of mine use some that are an app on their phone to capture perhaps smaller, less involved projects and do their reporting that way. But anything that you can do to record and assist you when you go back to prepare your reports is encouraged. We'll look at a minute about some standardized forms on a slide that AIA has, as well as CSI. But these reports, you should remember, should be created quickly. They should be distributed quickly. If you can do that within a day of the visit, you will be a hero. I know that is a really quick turnaround time, but if you are able to do that and confirm that you are being factual and complete as well as objective within that report, the construction community and your client will love you, because there is the information and you're able to move on from that observation to the next. Again, I'll just remind you, anything you see that's non-conforming or that needs to be rejected, do it immediately. Get that process handled right away and get it moving forward, and discuss it, document it. If there are claims about that, whether they're reported or not, delve into the messy part of that site observation as quickly as you can. Waiting is not going to make it any better. But what you should not do in these reports, my mentor that taught me this business said, be sure that you'd like this read aloud to your grandmother in court. And as long as he could say yes to that, then he felt like he was doing a good job on the site. Don't be extraneous, not extra information. Don't put hearsay in there or conject things that may be non-factual. Stick to the information, stick to what is complete and factual, and stay away from the rest of that stuff. So, there are easy parts that will make this turnaround of documents fairly easy to do quickly. Project names and report numbers, your contact information, when you were there, how long you were there, when you left, what the temperature, what the weather conditions were at the time, what site conditions were. It was a beautiful sunny day. Well, that's great, but it rained 3 inches here last night, so nobody's working today. So you may include information about what the site conditions are to let somebody know that it's under an inch of water, and that's a fact. That's not extraneous. Who were there? Who were the people there with you, and what kind of discussion did you have? You're establishing work that's in progress and completed. You're looking at stored materials and products. There may be items you talked about, the deficiencies you talked about, and be fair and reasonable and include what the contractor's comments are, because those are important to the life of the project. So if we look at the next slide, there are just some examples on it of some field observation reports. The one to the left is a CSI form, which is 9.1A. And companies have their own forms that they establish in varying forms, and they're electronic-based, fillable format, and able to be used. So find what works for you and your organization first. Review it with your risk management folks within your liability insurance company and or your attorneys, business partners, and be sure that it carries the information that you want it to before you use it, and then stick with that form, and be sure your staff and everyone that works in the organization is aware of how it gets used. So let's go forward one more slide before we have questions, and you'll see an example here that I was sharing with my friend. This is called ArcaSnapper, and it's a form that he uses on projects just right on his phone. Really has helped in his immediacy with his clients. As I said, it's on certain size jobs, certain scope of projects. But just remember, don't be too fast about it. Use caution and be sure that your information is solid and good before you're using a tool like this to distribute to everyone on the project. So, Matthew, any hands raised about the various forms of report there?
Yeah, we have a couple questions that have popped in here. First, I guess a comment from John saying that he thoroughly agreed with the first slide in this area, saying that in his opinion, it's irresponsible to send out a report a week later. We had a question that came in here from Robert, which I think we've talked about in past sessions, but it's always good to clarify. Should observed safety concerns be reported in a field report?
Woo! That's a great question. That is a really great question. We, of course, as architects, engineers, are not responsible for site safety or safety programs, but that's a big pause. First, I believe, and I have always been taught, that through our health, safety, and welfare requirements, should we observe something that is dangerous, should we observe something that is life-threatening on a project site, we are required to report that to the superintendent or the project manager. I have not in my past put that into a site observation report form, but I have gone directly to the superintendent and reported the issue so that they are made immediately aware of it. And I have, in fact, walked them to the place and shown them my concern while I was on the job site. I did not put that in my site observation report. I will say that I had one attorney explain my actions like this. He said, I feel okay with what... Now, here's my disclaimer. This is one attorney in North Carolina. But his explanation of what I did was that I made myself, and I'll use quotations, conspicuously obvious. Conspicuously obvious. So I took the superintendent with me. There were other people that he took with him who were responsible as subcontractors for the work. And it was something that was a dangerous condition. That was the support of a wall, temporary support of a wall. We were having weather that was less than perfect, and I felt like it was a life-threatening situation. So because I made myself conspicuously obvious with a crowd there gathered as I pointed and spoke, he felt like it was well documented should something have happened. But I did not put it in my site report. So that's just one example of your question about safety is critical. I suggest conversations again with your risk management company about, hey, tell me, if you call them up and said, come into our office and talk to us about risk management, you'd be one of their favorite customers. They'll come in and talk to you about do's and don'ts, their particular coverage. Ask them questions and pin them down on what should I do if I see this or that. I think it would make us all better practitioners.
All right. Next question here. I think the answer is going to be conspicuously absent. But Mark asks,
okay.
How do you handle when an owner directs you to put information into an observation report that is misleading or incorrect?
Woo! I just wouldn't do it. Yes, conspicuously absent. I think you go back and do what you know to be appropriate in your site report and distribute it. And your client may see it and be unhappy that you did that and did not follow his direction. But, we all worked so hard to get to the point we are in our profession. I think that whenever I'm faced with something that doesn't smell right, and doesn't look right, and doesn't feel right, there's a reason for that. And I think that that's an unreasonable request from your client and something that you just have to not do, and then have that conversation when you haven't done it. I realize that won't go well, but I would just do my report and issue it as I would any other and just leave that information out.
And then we have the last question here comes from Greg, and I think I know where you're going to go with this, but his question is, any comments on the inclusion of photos in reports?
Yes, use photos. I think they are incredibly important, but you must know every image that you are capturing in that photo. Be aware of what's in the forefield and in the background and in the middle, and realize what you're photographing. We, on these calls before, have talked about situations that arose because people captured images of things they didn't intend to. And in litigation, parties suing them were able to say, well, it's right here. You took a photograph of it, and it's in your report. How can you say you weren't aware? And, you know, the answer was, well, I didn't mean to, or I didn't see it back there. So when you're photographing pieces and parts, you need to be sure of what's in the whole image that you're attaching to your report. But they are critical, and we work for so many people in the chain of command, our clients particularly, who don't understand our jargon and our language, but who really get the pictures. So I think they're important to have, and long term, for those owners, operations and maintenance people, they can be a real key, and keep you a client in the future when they are able to discover something that was captured in an image and answer a question.
I'm going to follow-up question to that from John, but before, John's continuing with the funny one-liners here. In his response to the question about putting something in a report the client requests, even if it's incorrect or false, he says, Grandma would not approve.
That's right, Grandma would not.
But he does ask a question. He does ask a question as a follow-up to what we were just talking about, saying, "Do you think it's a good idea to delete the photos that aren't part of a report? So, you know, you go to the site, you take 25 photos, you include 3. Do you think it's a good idea to delete the other 22 then, so that they may not pop up in the future?"
Absolutely, and we've been told that by Doug on these calls in other subjects because. In that same example I was using, then in that litigation, the person would take 200 photographs, include 10 in the site visit, but archive the others. And the question was, what were you hiding? Because if you weren't hiding something, it doesn't cost you anything. You would have distributed all those photos. So Doug's comment was, use the photos in your report, get rid of everything else out of your firm records because it was extraneous to your observation that day, and delete it. Or use the photographs that you want in your report and then distribute the others as additional information to the report. But if you do that, you've got to know what's in them, because if you distribute something that is non-compliant, then you but I do not put them in my reports. Now, if you're experiencing something on a job site where a contractor is just negligent, and you're aware of that, I've never reported to OSHA myself on a job site. I've always had the ability to
gotten through, so feel free to move on to the next slide.
Okay, well, they are images. This section really applies to those projects where you have a full-time project representative. So these may be larger projects. I've had experience with water and wastewater treatment facilities where the municipality wanted someone on site. In fact, some of them have been 24/7 because construction may impede water flow, and that cannot happen. So what we're going to look at here is just a little bit of the difference between field observations, site observations that I'll go so far as to say normally do, versus ones where there is a full-time representative. So if you take a look at the next slide, this is just a CSI form that uses daily observations, and it's not meant for you to read it, but it's in the practice guide. So why would this be a different form? Well, because you're doing it daily, because you're able to make much more detailed notes about what's happening on a daily basis than if you're just there weekly or some other schedule. You're able to document activities that are going on at particular times and numbers of workers, etc. We won't go any further into that, but take a look at the next slide, and these are additional CSI forms for here's what you might do with a weekly visit. So this is just a slightly modified CSI form. There's another one for communications and how you might document communications. If we go to the next slide, there's one for memos and how you might correspond with memos. Yes, absolutely. A picture is worth 1,000 words. And here's just a reiteration of what we've talked about, being sure you know of everything that's in that view screen. And being sure that the contractor is doing their part, because many times we require them to do certain documentation, but perhaps don't follow up on that as much as we should. So again, this little short version here is mostly focused on when you're having a full-time representative on the site. You're able to capture much more of the project that may be concealed, and you're able to give that to the owner down the road. And it certainly may help in analysis of certain conditions as you move through the project. So those are just forms that exist within the practice guide that may be helpful to you. Let's take a look at the next slide. This is my swing at Okay, so if you take a look, is filled with, and these are not for you to read, but in certain locations within the practice guide, those all indicated a filing process and a filing system that can be very unique to the project and really important to your client at the end of the job when you turn all this over to them. So setting up a good way to record what goes on the project, to document the project, of course, electronically, so that it's able to be switched to them very easy. But towards the end of the practice guide, there's a whole format here, beginning on page 130, of how to format and file and eventually retrieve your project information. So we'll look at the next slide and just touch briefly, because we do in the practice guide, on where you'll be doing all this living. Your home away from home, the field office, which often we prescribe in our contract documents with certain amenities like air conditioning and heat and toilets and data access. Sometimes we have full-time folks on a job that have their own trailer. Sometimes they are in a combined trailer with a general contractor. If you take a look at the next slide, sometimes we're on projects where there's a very robust office development out on the site. You have an opportunity in most projects to establish what this field office will look like. So be sure that you take the time to do that. Again, I've worked with a lot of firms that use supplementary general conditions to define the trailer city that is going to be on a job and what those requirements are, again, down to the interior requirements for furnishing and communication. The reason this is important, let's take a look at the next slide, is there's a lot of information that we typically require to be maintained on a project and accessible for not only us, but for the whole construction team. So there's a permit set of drawings. The authorities having jurisdiction make their marks on a set of drawings that are maintained in these offices. So they obviously need to be organized, and these things need to be accessible. There are addenda that happen during the life of a job that everyone needs to know and use. Change orders as well, so that they're working off the most current set of documents, and whether it's submittal, shop drawings, products that maybe have been approved but there were slight modifications, all of that information needs to be there for their use and for ours as we are on a job site doing our observations. So these trailers are important. And let's take a look at the next slide and talk about one of the things that's really most important to our client, and that's record documents. I'm sure that you've had the experience going to a job site where you look for an updated set of record documents, and that's not being done on a daily basis. It's really important to come to a meeting of the minds with the superintendent to help them understand and help them see the advantage of doing that on a timely basis. You know, we talk about this in a lot of these presentations. They are professionals, craftspeople, dedicated as we are, have families. They want to go home. They don't want to work on the weekends or over Christmas or Thanksgiving or any other holiday, and we often forget that. So keeping these documents up to date shouldn't be something they do after hours. It ought to be part of what they do during the day with communications with their subcontractors and with us. When we see things and we're in there looking at it with them, and it's important for foundation locations and utilities, and it's important for things that are going to be concealed. So dimensional information is critical for our client, and anything that was changed that was not in the original drawings, it's really important to have it there. So impressing upon them the great importance of proper documentation for our client is critical. And then the last thing that I'll show you is a slide that is part of CSI's documents. And it is so important, and I've learned so much from taking this opportunity. And that is to follow up and see how you did. It's a tough conversation sometimes, but if you make this part of your firm culture, your repeat business will benefit from that. In sitting down and learning from what was successful for this client on your project and what the success stories were, and more importantly, what were the mistakes on the project and what could you have done better. It's a free, open, detailed discussion about how we make things better the next time. For this client, hopefully, for the next client, what were places where coordination could have been better, details could have been better. You can see the list there. Why did we have the change orders we had? Should we have involved the authority having jurisdiction? Were easements and issues with the utility company something that we could have done better at? And then turn around and have that meeting with your team if they aren't at the meeting with your client. to share that information so that next time out, you don't make the same mistakes. And I'll say this last word and then check for questions. Particularly do this if your firm uses prototype design and you're working for a client more than once. There is little that is more embarrassing than having the same change order happen on the same building with the same client more than once. And skipping this checkup and how you did in the end could have kept you from doing that. So don't just do it to check a box, but do it to learn. Are there any questions, Matthew, at this point?
Yeah, we had one question came in here from Bradley a while back saying, could you please discuss the difference in specificity between comments on a field observation report and comments on a substantial or final inspection report?
Well, so specificity on a field report to me would be more a explanation of my observation. So let me say it a different way with an example. If this block work in this area represents movement in a direction that's non-conforming, I need to say, this is not in compliance. Let me be more specific about, in the specifications, what you can do out of plumb, out of level, mortar joint size. These are the requirements. This area is not acceptable, but I'm going to tell you what, it's in a closet, and I'm going to let this go, and I'm going to come back, and I'm going to look right over here to see how you've improved that. The owner I've already talked with, we've looked at it, it's okay. They'll accept it the way it is, but you've got to correct this. And my specificity in a final inspection would be, this is non-compliant. We talked about this. Let's walk over here and look at what the example was where we discussed it. And you can see out of plumb, out of level, this is no good. It's got to go. Or it's rejected and the owner wants to see a credit for it. Now, that describes a little bit of me not doing my job, because had I been observant and covering enough ground, perhaps that non-compliant work wouldn't be in place. And I could have saved us both from having to go through the process of redoing it. But so I'm not sure if that answers the question, but that's a swing at it anyway.
We had one other question for Sharon, I think is kind of a good way to recap this session and start to highlight future sessions. So she's asking for feedback on where does this get us in the field, or does this get us filed in relationship to risk?
Now, Matthew, you go to the next slide, but I'm not sure I understood the question. Can you read that again?
Yeah, she's essentially, I think, asking is a recap for this entire area with us talking about observations and reports and everything else. How does this all relate to the idea of us managing risk as a group? So I think, if I remember correctly, risk is addressed in a future chapter that we'll be tapping on, I don't think next, but after that.
Right. We will be moving to a deeper dive into risk management in the next chapter. Actually, we'll look a little bit, but then we'll move further into risk management. I'm just going blank on the title of Chapter 7. It's on the next slide.
We do have clarification here from Sharon. She's actually talking about specifically this feedback form. Does it get filed? So when this is all done, is this submitted and actually as part of the information that would be up for discovery?
Yeah, that's a really great question. Yes, it could be. And so it should be very factual, but yes, and that's a great point. Show this to your risk management folks and say, this crazy guy told me I should do this. What do you think? And they're probably going to say, absolutely not, because it is a discoverable form if it is in your records for the project. So I'm just going to, Sharon, I just keep going back to my grandma. She was proud of what I was doing. I wouldn't worry so much about that stuff, but the way the world has become and the litigious atmosphere we're living in, that really doesn't apply much anymore. And we have to think about those things. So it is a great point that you should review with your risk management carrier to say, should we do this? Or maybe this is just a conversation where we don't keep notes. We keep mental records of what they thought we should do. Now, if you go back, the examples that I'm using about change orders, well, that's all well documented. RFIs, details that didn't work. Throughout the project, you've had those things documented either in requests for that information or changes in the contract price. So it probably isn't documenting anything that's new, but it could. It could. And so perhaps you want to think about what you would document this new, but I think it would be a little repetitive for some of those things that might get brought up in the discussion. But great point. Talk to risk management folks first.
All right. Well, I think that gets us to the end of the questions and comments. And we're only 5 minutes over the hour. Not too bad.
I'm sorry. I apologize for those of you that have only an hour set aside. But I enjoy the questions, and I think that makes it so much more meaningful. And we're going to keep moving through the practice guide. Matthew goes to the next slide. I think it's in there. We will be going to Chapter 7. No, it's not there.
Yeah,
or at least not on my
when I did the cleanup and edit, I think I may have missed that slide.
Oh, okay. Well, so anyway, the next chapter, I'm gonna look real quick here to see if I can tell you the next. So the next is quality control and quality assurance, which is at the center of risk management, and that is Chapter 7 in the practice guide. And that'll be November the 28th at noon. So it's quality assurance and quality control, which is Chapter 7 on November the 28th at noon. Sorry, Matthew, I didn't mean to steal your thunder there.
No problem. You are on top of your game here, Jim. So with that, again, thank you all for attending, and thank you, Jim, as always. We do hope to get Douglas on the call as well for next month, as I'm sure his lawyer background will come in handy as we get into that topic. Reminder, everybody, the session is recorded and will be posted to the CSI YouTube channel probably sometime tomorrow. As a heads up, I did have a notification on my screen saying that at a couple of different times there was GoToWebinar was experiencing audio issues, so I'll have to go through and check to make sure that the audio recording worked well, or I might have to do some creative splicing for that. Also, a reminder to everybody, once you log off today's call, about an hour or so following today's session, you should receive an email directly from GoToWebinar thanking you for attending, and there will be a small link. It'll be kind of nondescript, asking you to fill a survey. That survey will ask you for your opinion on today's topic, other topics you wish we would address in the future, and allow for you again to request a certificate of attendance that you can use for self-reporting for continuing education credits with AIA, USGBC, or any of the other associations that do like to collect that information. So with that, again, thank you all for attending. Thank you, Jim, for rocking another hour of good content here. Everybody seems to like it, and we look forward to seeing you in November.
Great, everybody. Take care. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.
All right. Thank you, everyone. You may now disconnect and have a great day. Bye, everyone.
See you, Matthew.